Event organizers say over 400,000 people took to the streets in Washington, D.C. this Saturday to demand an immediate ceasefire in Gaza as the war approached its 100th day. Protesters called on their elected officials, including, quote, genocide Joe Biden, to follow the will of a majority of Americans and end unconditional support to Israel. Demonstrators caught some conservative commentators' attention when they attacked a security fence outside the White House in the hours following the protest. President Donald Trump weighed in on Truth Social, writing, "So interesting to watch anti-Israel protesters violently demonstrating at the White House, getting close to tearing down the fences that protect the president, and nothing is even mentioned about it in the lamestream media, which is merely a subsidiary of the Democrat Party. No arrests, no nothing. Free the J6 hostages now."
Meanwhile, at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, journalists are currently hammering the Biden administration after National Security spokesman John Kirby accused a Huffington Post reporter of making up quotes in a story detailing potential U.S.-Saudi business planning on the ruins of Gaza. The journalist at the center of these accusations wrote on X, "The White House is using dirty tricks to undermine coverage of the Gaza war, and Biden is using tactics he's telling voters he opposes."
The Biden administration's attack on a journalist comes with a slew of anti-Palestinian censorship stories. It's the time of witch hunt in Israel. A university professor said he was jailed and held in solitary confinement in Israel for posting concern about the Gaza death toll. This weekend, the Sydney Morning Herald reported on secret WhatsApp messages purported to prove that the Australian Broadcasting Corporation fired award-winning Australian-Lebanese host Antoinette New after a high-level and coordinated letter-writing campaign from pro-Israel lobbyists. Even more, here in the United States, a federal lawsuit filed last week claims the city of Evanston, a Chicago suburb, has fired its racial equity leader for First Amendment-protected statements expressing support for Palestinians in Gaza. The onslaught from a protected speech perspective is incredible. Obviously, we have our own speech rules in the United States, which aren't mirrored in Israel. But the history teacher who was thrown into solitary confinement, I heard him telling his story on Democracy Now! In the last day or so, for simply saying that you support a ceasefire, simply saying that you want bombing to stop in Israel. An Israeli was punished in those ways for speaking out, which gives you a real sense of perhaps what could be described as authoritarian leanings in that country, as well as creeping authoritarianism in our own.
Sure. I would have to look more closely at the case of the DEI official who was fired. I tend to want to fire a lot of DEI officials.
For free speech?
Because the position should be eliminated in general.
Right, but she wasn't, again, fired because they're getting rid of DEI. She was fired because she made pro-Palestine.
I looked at it.
He was fired because of pro-Palestine statements.
If that's the case, then that's the case. Should not be fired for pro-Palestinian statements. Should simply probably delete those positions.
Why should they delete? Why shouldn't you be allowed to have a job and say free Palestine, or you want bombing to stop in Gaza?
No, you should not be fired for that. The diversity, equity, and inclusion positions should be eliminated. Are often, in fact, the ones doing the censorship at universities, obviously, in some city departments, making it impossible for other people to express their speech rights.
Do you think that every time there is a case where someone is alleged to have been punished for using their constitutional right to free speech, we should tap dance around whether or not we should feel good or bad about it on the basis of their job and whether or not you like their job? Is that true of whatever J6 protester? Is it true of a segment that we did earlier of a former pickup artist and right-wing journalist who was arrested by Ukraine and killed, who I vociferously defended in the last segment despite having no political overlap with him?
I will answer that if you let me. Government employees are paid by the taxpayers, and that's a forcible arrangement. I think all cities should eliminate redundant and unnecessary government positions to save their taxpayers more money. And so the kind of free speech argument loses a little bit of teeth. Of course, he shouldn't be imprisoned like the dissident in Ukraine, and they're not imprisoning him. If they were imprisoning him, I speak out against it. I might speak out against it anyway if I knew more of the exact details of the case, but I'm not automatically going to go to bat for a for government employees, I don't think they necessarily enjoy the same First Amendment rights in order to, like, you're not guaranteed a government job. It's paid for by the taxpayers.
No, but the Supreme Court has weighed in and said that working for the government does not strip you of your First Amendment protected rights. So the question is whether or not there should be condemnation, round, consistent, and unqualified condemnation of a city official, any employee, but particularly the city official in this case, being fired because he said, and this is the objectionable
Well, that's
quote.
what he says. He was fired because he said those things. The city says he was fired because he tried to insert pro-Palestinian statements into the statement that the city was making. I don't know why the city shouldn't be making any statement. Again, I don't know the exact details of the case, but that you're saying his argument, which that's his argument.
Right. His argument is that calling for a ceasefire resulted in his firing. And I think the question that people have to ask themselves is, if the city is putting out a statement, which I agree, I don't really understand why it's doing that, but if it's putting out a statement, are people being fired for advocating that the statement be more solidaristic with Israel, as opposed to people being fired for the statement being more solidaristic with Palestine? If your people are being punished by being pro-Palestine, then the issue isn't speech or whether or not they're overly politicizing the workplace. The issue is whether or not you are being punished in the United States of America for taking a particular political position. And that seems to be the case along the whole gamut of stories that we set up here. I don't want to miss one of the biggest stories here, which is that this Huffington Post reporter published a story about a plan that he reported out having talked to State Department officials, which showed that there's apparently a plan to have a 90-day window in which the United States is hoping to broker an arrangement, a normalization of ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and a reconstruction plan of Gaza that is supposed to get the normalization of Saudi Arabia back on track, relationship with Israel back on track, and to basically use the idea that they're working together to rebuild Gaza to help guard off any simmering resentments and frustrations in the Arab world about how the Gazans have been treated for the last 75 years, but in particular, the 23,000 of them that have been killed in the last 3 months. Once the story was reported out, the State Department, the Biden administration, took a kind of an unprecedented response. It came out in an email and said, this story is not true. Quotes attributed to U.S. officials are made up. It warrants no further comment. Now, the Huffington Post has stood behind this journalist. Apparently, they have a record of the quotes. I don't know if they had recorded the conversation or what have you. The quotes were given off the record, so they're not saying who said the quotes, obviously, in public. But finally, after about 72 hours or so, there was a kind of moderated response from the government that was published out and reported out in Semaphore, where the White House seems to be walking back at statements now saying the NSC clarified that the White House's comment specifically referred to one element of the story in which the online news outlet cited a document. So saying, oh, we weren't accusing the journalist of lying throughout, just in one narrow circumstance. But I think it does show the sensitivity around reporting out these issues and how journalists are under fire in the same way that Democrats claimed Donald Trump was putting journalists under fire, calling them liars and cheats and targeting them in this way. Now we're seeing the Biden administration lashing out when they see a story that they think paints them in an unfavorable light with respect to Israel.
Before we go, I don't think we should miss commenting on the fact, Trump saying that pointing out the protesters trying to tear down scaffolding, throwing things at the cops, no arrests being made. Is it fair to wonder whether there's a double standard at play? I'm sure the organizers of this protest won't be arrested and accused of fostering a terrorist event. Now, of course, I've criticized Trump in the past for, if freeing the J6 people meant so much to him, he could have done that while he was in office. But I think a lot of conservatives will say that there are different standards for the protesters depending on their political ideology.
What should they be charged with?
With the same thing, feuding with cops, the same way the people.
I didn't see any allegations that there was any physicality with cops.
I see things thrown at them.
Oh, okay, so I saw people pulling out a gate. I didn't see any trespass, which is what people were charged with. I didn't see battery charges, which is what people on J6 were charged with. So again, if you can actually compare someone on J6 who was charged and arrested with shaking a gate and draw that comparison, I think that would be a fair comparison to make. But I, again, don't think we should minimize and misrepresent the very serious charges many J6 protesters were in fact charged and arrested for, and make superficial comparisons to just any other protest.
Bottles, flags at the police officer. That's what the New York Post reports.
All right. Well,
decide for yourself, I guess, whether that's a double standard. More Rising right after this.